Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Seeker session of 2022. I hope you're having a good new year so far. And let's say hello to Jay Cobley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. It's the best Sunday of the month.
Great.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
We're going to be looking today at original blessing, returning to the source. At this time in the pandemic, a lot of folks are feeling like it's Groundhog Day. I know a lot of people who are feeling quite hopeless, quite pessimistic, feeling cut off from the world and from other people. And it's so important in times like these that we focus on the abundance of the present moment without projecting ourselves too much into an awful future. So there's no denial in this. We acknowledge what's going on, and we all also acknowledge that life has beauty, that truth and goodness continue to exist. We're not locked inside some awful parallel reality called the pandemic. So that's why I wanted to begin this year with an exploration of original blessing, which we need so urgently to help us weather the storms that are here as well as the ones that are coming. Original blessing is a radical reimagining of our place in a world that has suffered untold damage on account of biblical beliefs in original sin. The notion that humankind is inherently flawed, fallen, cast out, just evil waiting to happen, has put us at odds with not only ourselves, but the natural world. It has also ripped us off, spiritually speaking, by depriving us of the truth about who we actually are and our inheritance as creatures of a sacred universe. Original blessing tells us that we are whole and connected, that we are inherently good, driven by love, creativity, play, and conscience, and that we're held by the love of God, connected to a divine source by an innocence that can't be broken. We're not talking about innocence in the sense of naivete or nothing bad is ever going to happen to us. We're talking about innocence as in still connected, not separate, whole, integrous. This is sometimes called a second innocence. What it is a return to wholeness after hard experience through deliberate choice and effort. Innocence at the end of the day is a choice to use beginner's mind, to be fully where we are, not mired in the past or projected into the future, able to accept, to move on, and to forgive. The novelist Marilynne Robinson writes, quote, "There is an earned innocence, I believe, which is as much to be honored as the innocence of children," unquote. This earned innocence requires intentionality, but it doesn't come from outside of us. And this is an essential point. We don't need religious intervention to be ourselves, to know ourselves as we are, as part of the garden, as creatures who have never been expelled, we've never been sinful, we've never been separate. And to know that, we only need to look within. When something is your true nature, the correct practice is to pause, reflect, and self inquire, to remove the obstacles that prevent us from knowing ourselves. In other words, to be fully present. Presence itself is innocence. It's about being undefended, undistracted, and available. It's about being childlike without being children. This natural state of being is the heart of what we mean by original blessing. Original blessing is a term that was popularized by our guest speaker in the Seekers Forum this month, Matthew Fox, who wrote a book in 1983 by that title. Matthew Fox is a radical. He was silenced by the Catholic Church for calling it a dysfunctional patriarchy and having the gall to call God mother. And for that, they came down on him, and for a year, he wasn't able to speak publicly. I remember seeing Matthew Fox for the first time in the late 1980s in New York City, shortly after the Vatican lifted its silence. It was at the Quaker Meeting House in Manhattan, and the place was packed. And I'll never forget it. He was on fire that day. He was talking about the need to retrieve Jesus's teaching from the fundamentalist forces of religion. He was talking about ecumenicism and the importance of having an open door policy towards spirituality rather than, dividing ourselves into tribes. His passion sort of belied his priestly experience because Matthew Fox is very unassuming as a person. But as he was speaking, he was railing against the forces of fear and pessimism that are so prevalent in our society as well as in our religion. He said they need to be countered by awe and goodness if we hope to survive as a species. The next day, I was sitting on a park bench next to him in Washington Square, and he was giving me his first interview after this 1 year silencing. And Matthew talked about original blessing as the exciting promise of what he called creation spirituality, which was a term that was new to me at the time. He said that while we may not all be Christian, living in a Christian dominated world makes it necessary for all of us to reject the doctrine of original sin as it's understood by fundamentalist religion. So, what is creation spirituality? It is a theological movement that shifts the emphasis of life and belief and practice from a focus on redemption to a focus on creation. Creation spirituality brings together wisdom from indigenous cultures, mystical traditions, world religions, scientific cosmological explanations of the universe, as well as the artist's creative ethos. It also draws inspiration from movements in social justice, feminism, and environmentalism, as well as science. Creation spirituality is a spirituality of the earth and the cosmos that views creation, not the Bible, as our primary revelation and one that is perpetually emerging. Do you see how revolutionary that is? Going from a spiritual orientation that's based on a book and its mythology, which was written by human beings, a book that never changes, that reflects terrible biases as well as violence, and strips us of our natural identity by putting us in the role of sinners, victims, slaves. Switching from that to a view of spiritual life that's in line with nature and our actual lived experience. This kind of spirituality has roots in creation centered consciousness. And these roots are found in many of the ancient teachings, in the original teachings of the Old Testament, as well as in the reflections of medieval mystics such as Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Mechtild of Magdeburg. Earth-based spirituality views most of our current evils, from environmental destruction to global conflict, as symptomatic of a culture that has ceased to have what the late cultural historian and scholar of religions Thomas Berry called a functional cosmology. According to Thomas Berry, the Western philosophical split between religion, science, creation, and humanity can only be mended by changing our origins story from one that's based on a fall to one that recognizes the 15 billion year universe story according to cosmic evolution. The Genesis story of Jewish and Christian traditions has failed to provide modern humanity with a sense of communion and kinship with a universe that's alive, intrinsically sacred, intelligent, and still in the process of growing. What we need now is a creation story that integrates humanity with the natural world and science, as well as with metaphysics. This story begins by acknowledging that the 2 trillion galaxies of the universe are a blessing in themselves. So is our singular ability to discover so much about it, the ability to observe these brilliant cerebral cortexes of ours and technological wizardry that has enabled us to uncover so many of the secrets of the universe. Human awareness and intelligence is a great blessing. Creation spirituality doesn't deny the presence of evil, suffering, loss, or pain. It simply holds them up against a larger background that's composed of love and supported by a force of nature that is our eternal ally. The mystic worldview, whatever tradition it comes out of, always emphasizes unity over duality and teaches us that while our differences may be real, they're not true, meaning that they exist, but they don't last. And this is a very important distinction between what is real and what is true. It's the difference between the relative and the absolute. To the mystic, the underlying unity of things is the truth, while the changing conditions of reality swirl around on top of it. In other words, waves are real, but they're not the ocean. Or rather, they are the ocean, and their temporary forms as waves are passing undulations that disappear as soon as they rise up. Non duality teaches us to remember the ocean, which is also the heart of original blessing and creation spirituality. And they turn conventional thinking upside down. So let's look at some of the specific differences between this life promoting spirituality and the dualistic earth denying one with which we've been living for the last 2,000 years. Let's start with the creator. According to the teachings of creation spirituality, it's not God the Father, it's God the Mother, or at least a gender balanced, unpatriarchal image of the divine. Instead of seeing asceticism as the path to salvation, renunciation, creation spirituality emphasizes aestheticism, a savoring of existence and experience, and enlivenment through beauty. The idea that mortifying the body is a virtue, suppressing our creature nature with its reminders of desire and death, is anathema to original blessing, which is far more interested in giving birth and bringing vital new energy into the world than it is with suppressing the body, suppressing the material, suppressing the physical. Rather than aim to control our passions and seeing them as a curse, there's a celebration of passion, of eros, of ecstasy in creation spirituality. It's understood that discernment is essential. This isn't hedonism that we're talking about, but that if we use love as a compass for navigating passion, including love for ourselves, and not doing things to harm ourselves, that is a way to ensure a virtuous life. Original blessing views suffering not as the wages of sin, but as an experience that's shared by all living beings, an experience that connects us. Suffering is the birth pangs of the universe, you could say, and we each share in a measure of that universal pain. Death isn't viewed as a punishment, a thing to be feared or avoided, or a time of judgment, but rather as a natural event, a prelude to recycling and rebirth. It's interesting that as we heal the divide between ourselves and the planet, our attitudes toward death care are slowly changing as well. There's a new movement that you've probably heard about for being recycled after we die, allowing our bodies to be used to replenish the earth without embalming or a casket or reducing ourselves to ash and wasting our useful materials. I find this thought very appealing. Although it's unfortunate that they refer to it as human composting. They really need to rebrand this new form of death care. In any case, non-dual approach to death, the mystic approach of reunifying ourselves with the ground that brought us forth, is closely aligned with the ethos of creation spirituality. It points to a dialectical both and approach rather than a dualistic either or. Because either or separates and both and unifies. It's as simple as that. And in the same way, spirit doesn't oppose matter. The idea that the two would be somehow separated is ludicrous. Where is this dividing line between the material and the spiritual, between the body and the God within? It doesn't exist. It's a mental construct created by religion to reify itself as an institution, to exile people from their own bodies, and to control them through a system of shame and penance and ultimate reward. Instead of being split off from ourselves and our world, there is what Thomas Aquinas called a wonderful communion between the physical and the metaphysical. Instead of personal salvation being the goal, our focus begins to shift toward healing and saving all of humanity. Original blessing tells us that the eternal life is now. It's now, it's not after death. In fact, time itself is seen differently. It's seen not in a linear continuum from past to future, but through the lens of the eternal now. The mystic view of time has nothing to do with our man-made notion of time as a ticking clock. Instead, the mystic view of time is always present. I think of it more like a pebble that's dropped in the water with ripples radiating out from the center, than a linear sequence of nanoseconds piling up one on top of the other. Because when we drag the past with us, what happens is that our memories fossilize. They fossilize on top of us a bit like coral. The dead bodies of our memories fossilize. And then we move through our lives freighted with the past, calcified in our memories. And we get heavier and heavier as we age, unless we're careful to step out of time and remember what philosophers called nunc stans, the power of now. And that's why awakened people often seem so childlike. It's because they're not hobbling around underneath a carapace of identity formed from the dead remains of time past. The nature of things is to fall away. It's only the human mind that makes them solid with names and stories that we identify with, which become part of our identity. And thus, it make us unable to leave them behind. Reframing our connection to time is what we do when we meditate, when we pray, when we write, when we create art, when we spend time in nature, when we care for our loved ones. Whatever it takes to stop the mind and bring us here, dropping us into the eternal present, is a form of practice. That's where we want to live. In creation spirituality, virtue is found in creativity more than in obedience. Virtue is more sensual than conceptual. It cares more about giving thanks and praise than assigning guilt, shame, or the need for redemption. And finally, original blessing moves us from a theistic way of thinking, this idea that your religion is the only way to God, to what's known as panentheism. Panentheism considers God and the world to be interrelated, that the world is in God and God is in the world. If you're an atheist who's turned off by the idea of God, then just replace the word with spirit. Panentheists believe that spirit and matter are one, that the divine mystery is here now, and that we are agents of a higher intelligence who have access to the secrets of that intelligence. Taken together, these qualities of original blessing really do represent the hope for humanity that's currently in a kind of lockstep toward destruction. They do away with tribalism and fundamentalism, and they're also 100% sustainable, not only ecologically, but psychologically and spiritually. Just imagine what a world based on the principles of original blessing would look like. How differently we would be living through this pandemic if these ideas were dominant. This is such important stuff for us to ponder as the new year comes, as we navigate our way forward through the continuing threat that we're facing. It's a path toward healing the divides between us as well, and blessing this extraordinary earth that we've been given. As Matthew Fox said to me that day in Washington Square, we live in a beautiful universe, not a pretty one. Beauty encompasses all of life when we look through an enlightened perspective, through sacramental eyes. As the Indian poet Tagore put it, beauty is simply reality seen with the eyes of love. And that is the vision of original blessing. So let's do a bit of writing. And if you're not in a mood to write, folks, just use this prompt as something to reflect on while we do the writing. So I'd like you please now just to take 15 minutes to write about what you need to bless in your life today in order to feel whole. What do you need to bless in your life today in order to feel whole? And what would that look like? Be as specific as you can be, please. We'll take 15 minutes and then we'll come back together as a group.